Hi, my name's Paddy Nixon. I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Canberra, and I'm about to have a conversation with Michelle Grattan about the week in politics. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Paddy.
Well, I'm going to start off with aged care. Victoria continues to report new COVID cases and deaths. The Royal Commission is sitting this week to look at the impact of COVID on the aged care sector. And the council assisting the Commissioner, Peter Rosen, said that the government hadn't done enough to protect the aged care sector. And of course, this was rebuffed by Brendan Murphy, the former Chief Medical Officer and current Secretary for Health. Can you tell me was the aged care sector really prepared for this, and should the government have done some more?
Well, I guess it's who you believe, but I think that there's a strong case to say that the sector wasn't adequately prepared. The health authorities, the government, early on said that this was a vulnerable part of the community. So it wasn't as though the risk wasn't known. But the real problem is that the system is broken. It relies on a casual workforce, many of whom work across facilities. They're low paid. When some of them got ill, they didn't at that stage have any sickness cover. Later that's been rectified for the pandemic. But in general, these facilities, and in particular the ones for profit, they don't have adequate staffing numbers often. They're not compelled to have a certain level of staffing, a certain level of qualified nurses. So therefore, the sector was incredibly vulnerable to start with. And then it does seem that the planning that was done just was not strong and comprehensive enough. Now, the government would reject that and say there was a plan and that everything that could be done was done. But I don't think that stands up to scrutiny.
No, and actually many of the commentaries at the moment are simply that not only does it not stand up to scrutiny, but the sector simply wasn't in a position to respond to COVID.
Well, that's right. And of course, more lessons should have been learnt out of the experience in Sydney when you had a couple of nursing homes really hard hit. But they weren't learnt quickly enough. And then, of course, in the Victorian second wave, the sector there has really been devastated. More than 100 facilities have had cases, and as we speak, there are more than 1,000 residents. They're not all in residence, of course, some are in hospital, but more than 1,000 residents have tested positive, and more than 1,000 workers. Now, they're big, big numbers. And it's not just that there's been a large number of deaths, but also the trauma of families, the general fear that's gone through the aged care community, residents, families, has been terrible.
So sticking with the COVID debate, the Premier in Victoria, Daniel Andrews, is facing up to the cameras as he usually does, but he's coming under increasing fire around his response to the second wave and whether he should have brought in the Defence Forces to support them. Should he have done so? Did he make a mistake?
This is all about the quarantine issue, and breaches of quarantine in Victoria really triggered this second wave, which quickly got out of control, partly also because the contact tracing regime wasn't up to the task in that state. Now, the Defence Forces were on offer and eventually they went in, but they weren't used for the actual supervision of quarantine. That was left to security guards, and they were lax, and therefore the problems arose. Obviously, in retrospect, it would have been much better to use the Defence Forces. What Daniel Andrews has done is put all this question of quarantine off to an inquiry, but what his critics are saying is that there should be answers now, and he's been reluctant to get into the detail of this. He said, I'm concentrating on what I have to do now. I don't want to engage in these debates. He's under a lot of pressure. including from the federal government. And we saw the Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds, this week release timelines and documents and so on. And this is a really divisive issue between state and federal governments, although Scott Morrison, who wants to preserve as much unity as possible in the National Cabinet, has been very restrained in his comments on the whole issue in Victoria.
And do you think in the long term, the balance of how the Premier has managed COVID there with these divisive issues, how do you think that will impact him going forward?
Look, it's hard to know at this stage. I think he has considerable support in Victoria, but it has been declining support for the way he's handled this issue. But look, we're still, frankly, in the early stages of this whole COVID thing. It might seem as though it's been going on forever, but it'll go on for a long time, both at the health level and at the economic level, and you wouldn't want to make predictions about how any individual leaders are going to come out of it at the end of the day.
And then to move to something that's obviously front and centre in our thinking here in the university, the government released the draft legislation around university fees, where they're raising fees in the humanities and the arts and reducing fees in areas that they describe as a national interest. There's been a little bit of a pushback from the National Party who's saying, taking issue with the legislation, suggesting that they recategorise some of the key areas such as psychology and social work, etc. How do you think this is going to impact both within the Liberals and the Nationals and their relationship, but also the progress of the bill?
Well, I think it's very interesting that the Nationals have taken on this issue. It's part of a general push to assert themselves that we've seen lately, but they are arguing that the fact that courses like psychology and social work and courses related to mental health are going to cost so much more, will disadvantage country areas in particular, students from those areas, but also services in the long run in those areas. And I think because they've come out very explicitly and said all this, they've put forward a list of demands. There are other issues that they're taking up in the bill as well. And it will be very difficult, I think, for the government not to make some concessions to them, because they have gone out front and centre and said, we want changes. So it'll be fascinating to see whether the government gives in entirely or makes some compromises, meets them halfway, but there'll have to be negotiations very soon, because the government does want this legislation through by the end of the year.
Just moving to a final issue, we are expecting the long-awaited report on the role of Australian Defence Forces in the killings of civilians. This is a really significant issue and a very big issue for the reputation of not just of the Defence Forces of Australia. How do you think this one's going to play out?
This is all about how our special forces behaved in Afghanistan some years ago, and there have been a whole range of allegations about acts that went to the killing of civilians, the bad treatment of prisoners, whatever. This is not about what happened in the fog of war, but incidents apart from actual conflict situations. It's been a very long-running inquiry, and we are expecting it soon, although it keeps getting pushed back. But the Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds, has said that Australians need to prepare themselves for some pretty bad conclusions out of this. So I think if she is saying that, it indicates that the picture that will be painted will not go to the credit of the Special Forces. Now, There is, of course, work that's been done to try to address some of the issues involved, the culture and so on. But given that Scott Morrison in particular really puts the Defence Forces up there front and centre as heroes in the Australian story. For example, whenever he gives a speech and acknowledges the Indigenous people's land, he has a special mention for Australian Defence Forces and serving and past and veterans. So I think that it will be a reputational problem for defence, and that the defence establishment and the government will have to make it very clear that these problems have been addressed and will continue to be addressed in the culture that surrounds and governs our defence forces. Of course, the point should be made that we are talking about a very small number of people here, but the special forces have a particular and central role often in the soldiers we send abroad, and it is especially important that they are recognised as people with the highest integrity and moral values, and that they bring these qualities to their deployments.
Look, that's, as always, Michelle, an absolutely fascinating insight, and I look forward to chatting with you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paddy. See you soon.